I'm not as 100% confident, but I get what you guys are saying with this.
Literally, there's no entity in free and open source software and in Linux that if they died, like the whole thing would collapse. There's nothing that big. Even the Linux kernel is not.
Let's touch on that as our final little topic here. Let's touch on the Linux Foundation very, very briefly. So
stepped in it again.
Yeah, thank you, Derek. So both of you guys have been following. You know that the Linux Foundation has been generally kind of stepping back their funding of Linux kernel development, right? This last year, they reduced their overall spending down to 2% of their revenue is now directed towards the Linux kernel. Not 2% of Linux in general, but 2% directed towards the kernel. And they got rid of long-term Linux support releases. They got rid of those. Those are gone. And they've decreased the total amount that they spend on Linux kernel development as well over the year. Now, that said, they are still the gatekeeper, and they do own the trademarks and the core copyrights. So, being as they are the gatekeepers, they pay the gatekeepers. I mean, the two core gatekeepers are Linus Torvalds and Greg KH, right? They're the guys who essentially control the bleeding edge Linux kernel and the long-term Linux kernels, which isn't really as long-term as it used to be, but still. What happens if something happens to the Linux Foundation, like what we're seeing with Red Hat? And I want to kind of build this in an overall idea here. The Linux Foundation is a $250 million per year enterprise, right? They bring in a huge amount of money, and almost all of that comes from very large companies like Microsoft, Red Hat, Amazon, and the
Google,
like, right?
Meta, all those companies.
Yeah. Companies that in many cases are either currently moving away from Linux or have a long-term history of being somewhat antagonistic towards Linux, right? So it seems feasible, if not incredibly likely, that we see a scenario where that investment into Linux not only decreases going forward, but decreases potentially catastrophically. Do you see that as a potential issue, being as they are the gatekeeper and they do control the trademark? Do you see that as a potential issue on the Linux kernel side of things?
It's a tough one because I trust the Linux Foundation about as much as I trust Mozilla at this point. And that's
good, man. Good answer.
2% of their funding. I don't see the possibility of a Linux Foundation collapsing unless there is a very similar thing happening like it did with Red Hat. Like that's obviously a possibility considering, current state of massive organizations.
Well, I could see it being a situation kind of like with Sun and Open Office, where, the paid staff can stay there, but all the free contributors, they're just going to leave. They're going to fork it. There'll still be a Linux kernel. It just won't be under the name Linux because they'll have to fork it and rename it. But the kernel would live on.
That's true.
Who would do that?
Trust me, there's people that probably are not on the payroll at the Linux Foundation that probably could do the roles of somebody like Linus or.
Assuredly.
Yeah. So
there's great devs out there that work on the Linux kernel, long-term ones, but who's going to do that in such a way where everyone adopts it? Right? Because if we end up having...
at first you would have 3 forks. 2 of them would have to die in the first 6 months, which always happens.
Yeah, it's true. That is true, right? Right. It's sort of like when they forked the GIMP project because they didn't like the name of the GIMP and they wanted to create a different thing. And then that project just kind of sort of petered out. And then that created another fork that it sort of petered out. Things like that sort of happen. But I don't know. That does raise red flags for me. Like it raises concerns for me because from a practical standpoint, like let's say the Linux Foundation, worst case scenario, doesn't kill off Linux, right? Because they make money with it. They don't want to kill off a bread and butter making machine. That prints some sweet cheddar, that thing does. So they keep it going, but they continue to reduce their overall investment in it. Now, if that potentially causes problems for end users, enterprise folks, whoever, a fork becomes a good idea. But then who forks it who controls that fork?
Well, really,
and how
there's
does
one
the
company.
practicality-
There's one company that runs the whole show, if we're being honest, and that's Google. Wherever Google goes, that's going to drive kernel development.
Thank you, Derek. Yes, exactly.
Because if it's not a company, like it's very difficult to find someone who, like, the Linux kernel is not like a little terminal. Like, this is a multi-million line project. It is with like tens of thousands of commits every maybe 1,000 commits every release. Like, this is a giant project to shepherd, and but need
maybe
someone
a fork would be a good thing because you could get rid of some of that bloat now.
I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Brodie.
Is you need someone who, like, Linus doesn't write code for the kernel anymore. His entire position is
more or less
managing the kernel. Like that in and of itself is difficult. You need someone whose full-time position is that, and that's not going to be done by a volunteer unless it is something more stripped down, like, you know, you become more like a BSD sort of situation where you have a lot less support, but it's a lot more manageable. And I don't know if something the scale of the kernel, because we're not in the 90s anymore. Like, you can't manage something the scale of the kernel just as a volunteer. Like, that's just not viable unless you have millions of dollars in the bank. You won the lottery and you just want to, like, live out your life.
It's a big project. Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, that's a big job.
I don't think
that's a big boy job with big boy pants involved, for sure.
I don't think the Linux kernel could ever go the route of Red Hat and IBM, though, because we already mentioned there's a multi-trillion-dollar company, Google, that makes seriously hundreds of billions of dollars a year off of Linux because of their Linux-based operating systems. They're not going to ever let the Linux Foundation run their money, right? Trust me, Google would never let
a lot of money. No, Google, Microsoft, and Amazon all make a tremendous amount of money off of Linux. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of money there, and they don't want to give up money. They love money. Money is sweet, so they're going to keep that going. You're right, as long as they can. But
so
we're going to end up
the minute it affected their pocketbooks, Google would shut down the Linux Foundation, doing whatever shenanigans they may want to do.
Maybe. I'm not convinced.
With enough money, trust me.
Convinced. I mean,
they'd make it happen.
I agree. They
can take the entire kernel team and pay them whatever they want, and Google could just take the kernel and keep it going.
I mean, especially with the amount of money that the Linux Foundation currently pays for it, it's not much.
It's not much. It's really not
much. It's not much at all. All right, gentlemen.